She was terrified of the Duke. But he saved her. Short fantasy story. The rumors had started somewhere between the village of Ashwick and the iron gates of Blackwood Hall, and by the time Elspeth Morrow's hired carriage rattled up the long gravel drive, she had collected at least 6 different versions of them. The Duke of Raven was scarred from a duel. The Duke of Raven had gone mad after his mother died. The Duke of Raven had thrown his last 3 servants down the stairs, dismissed his entire household in a single afternoon, and spent his winters alone in the East Wing talking to the portraits. The Duke of Raven had once made a visiting lord cry simply by looking at him. Elspeth sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight and told herself that rumors were, by their nature, unreliable. She had been telling herself this since her father had appeared in the doorway of her bedroom 3 weeks ago with the expression of a man who had something terrible to say and had been practicing it. "It's a companion position," he had said. "For the Duke's aunt. A Lady Winifred St. Aubyn, very elderly, very comfortable. You'll have your own room. The pay is generous." "And the Duke?" Elspeth had asked, because she was not foolish. Her father had looked at the floor. "Is said to be somewhat reclusive." Somewhat reclusive. She had since learned that this was the way people described Arthur Street Aubyn, Duke of Raven, when they were being kind. The way they described him when they were not being kind involved words like fearsome, cold, and the Beast of Blackwood Hall, which was not a title that inspired confidence in a woman travelling to live in his house. The carriage stopped. Elspeth waited for a footman. No footman came. After a full minute, the carriage door opened from the outside, and Elspeth Morrow came face to chest with the largest human being she had ever encountered in her 23 years of life. He was not what she had expected. The rumors had given her a monster, misshapen, wild-eyed, draped in shadows. What she got was a man of perhaps 32, tall enough that she had to tip her head back to find his face, with dark hair that had not been powdered and a coat that had seen considerable weather. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were grey and entirely expressionless, the way deep water is expressionless, not empty, but concealing. He was, she registered in some distant and inconvenient part of her mind, extremely handsome. This did not help. "Miss Morrow," he said. Not a question. Not a welcome. "Your Grace." She gathered her skirts and stepped down from the carriage, and then her hem caught on the iron step, and the world tilted, and Elspeth Morrow, who had been raised to be dignified in all circumstances, pitched forward and fell face-first into the mud directly beside the Duke of Raven's boots. A silence followed that seemed to last considerably longer than it actually did. She pushed herself up onto her hands, mud on her chin, on her cheek, on the front of her grey travelling dress, and looked up. The Duke was looking down at her with the expression of a man reviewing a very disappointing document. He did not offer his hand. "I asked for a companion for my aunt," he said, "not a clumsy acrobat." He stepped aside so she could stand under her own power, which she did, with what she felt was remarkable composure given the circumstances. "Do try not to break the floorboards, madam. They are original." He turned and walked toward the house. Elspeth stood in the drive, mud drying on her face, and watched him go. She had 2 choices. She could climb back into the carriage and instruct the driver to take her home to a father who had already spent the advance on her first month's wages. Or she could follow the Duke into his enormous terrible house and do her job. She followed. "Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden beauty and unexpected love, I'd be so grateful for a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories where pain shatters and true character shines through. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and your presence makes these stories come alive." Blackwood Hall was as large inside as it appeared from the drive, vaulted ceilings, dark wood, windows that let in the grey English light in long flat shafts. A housekeeper named Mrs. Pruitt, small and brisk and clearly accustomed to managing the gap between the Duke's manners and the world's expectations, appeared from a side corridor and took Elspeth's cloak with the practiced sympathy of someone who had seen this particular expression on new arrivals before. "Lady Winifred is resting," Mrs. Pruitt said quietly. "She tires easily in the mornings. I'll take you up presently. His Grace," she glanced in the direction he had disappeared, "is not as bad as he seems." "He let me lie in the mud," Elspeth said. "Yes," Mrs. Pruitt said, with the tone of someone who did not have a good answer to this. "He does take time." Lady Winifred Street Aubyn was 81 years old, very small, and entirely delightful. She received Elspeth in a room crowded with books and bird cages and mismatched furniture, took both her hands, and said, "You have an honest face, child, and ink on your fingers. I shall like you very much." She paused. "Did Arthur help you from the carriage?" "Not precisely," Elspeth said. Winifred laughed. It was a surprisingly robust sound for a woman of her size and age. "No. He wouldn't. He forgets himself, sometimes, when he's thinking about other things. He's not unkind, Miss Morrow. He simply doesn't always remember to perform kindness. There is a difference." Elspeth thought about the grey expressionless eyes and the immaculate boots standing beside her face in the mud. "I'm sure there is, my lady," she said politely. That night, alone in her room at the top of the west staircase, Elspeth sat at the small writing desk and composed a letter to her friend Margaret in London. "The Duke," she wrote, "is exactly as reported. I am to read to his aunt and keep her company and, I suspect, simply be present in a house that has too much silence in it. I have decided not to be afraid of him. He seems like the sort of person who can tell when he is being feared, and I suspect he finds it tedious. I will instead treat him as I would treat a very large and unpredictable dog, with calm, without challenge, and without making sudden movements." She sealed the letter and went to bed. In the morning, she would discover that treating Arthur Street Aubyn like anything she had a system for was considerably more complicated than she had anticipated. The library was supposed to be out of bounds. This was not written anywhere. It was simply one of those understandings that accumulated around the Duke of Raven like weather, not stated, not explained, simply known by the household staff and communicated to Elspeth by Mrs. Pruitt on her second morning with a meaningful look and a slight tilt of the head toward the east corridor. Elspeth lasted 4 days before the library became unavoidable. Lady Winifred had asked for a specific book, a natural history of the Somerset coast, large and green, which she was entirely certain was in the library on the third shelf from the left near the window. On the 5th morning, with Winifred's persistent cough keeping her confined and her eyes too strained for her own reading, Elspeth went to find it. The library at Blackwood Hall was the most beautiful room she had ever entered. 2 floors of shelves, a gallery walkway, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and windows that looked out over the grey park with its bare November trees. It smelled of cedar and old leather and something faintly chemical that Elspeth couldn't immediately identify. She found the natural history on the third shelf exactly as Winifred had said, tucked it under her arm, and was entirely prepared to leave in an orderly fashion when she noticed the telescope. It stood near the east window on a heavy oak stand, one of the newer reflecting models, and it was clearly broken. The secondary mirror housing was tilted at the wrong angle, and someone had wrapped a piece of twine around the focuser in a solution that was creative but structurally wrong and would, Elspeth calculated, result in the mirror slipping entirely the next time any weight was applied to the eyepiece. She knew this because her father, before the gaming houses had taken everything else, had owned one just like it. She set the natural history down and was examining the mirror housing when a shadow fell over her that had nothing to do with the windows. She turned. The Duke stood 4 feet away, holding a small brass tool and looking at her with an expression that had moved from the usual blankness into something sharper. He was in his shirt sleeves. This was more alarming than she had expected it to be. "This is not a public room," he said. "No, Your Grace." She did not step back. She had decided not to step back from him. "Lady Winifred asked me to retrieve a book. I noticed your telescope. I am aware of my telescope. The secondary mirror housing is incorrectly aligned." She indicated the twine wrapping. "And this will not hold. When you next apply pressure to the focuser, the mirror will shift and the image will distort beyond use." A pause. Something changed in the grey eyes, not warmth exactly, but attention. A different quality of attention. "I have been attempting to correct the alignment for 2 weeks, he said, after a moment. "You're using the wrong lens to calibrate it." She pointed. "If you use the concave rather than the flat, the reflection will show you the misalignment directly." He stared at her. Then he crossed to the instrument table, picked up a different lens, and applied it. He bent to look. Straightened. Looked at her again. "Where did you learn that?" "My father had one. Before." She didn't elaborate on the before. "I used to help him with it." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a second stool from beneath the instrument table with his foot and sat at the telescope, setting the lens correctly into place. He did not tell her to leave. She stayed. Partly because leaving now felt like retreating, and partly because the library was warm and she was genuinely curious about whether the alignment would correct properly. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, him adjusting, her occasionally directing, neither of them commenting on the strangeness of the situation. He was precise and patient with the instrument in a way that surprised her. The large, cold hands that had not helped her from the mud were perfectly careful with the brass fittings. "There," she said finally, when the image sharpened. He looked through the eyepiece. A pause. "Yes." He straightened, and she realized she had moved closer over the course of the 20 minutes, close enough that he was looking down at her from a very short distance, his shadow falling across her shoulders. He did not move away. He looked at her face with that focused, measuring attention, and then his hand lifted, she went perfectly still, and for one suspended moment his fingers hovered near her cheek. Then he frowned, stepped back, and said, "You have ink on your nose." Elspeth touched her face. She did, in fact, have ink on her nose, presumably from the focuser. "Meddlesome women," the Duke said, but he said it to the telescope rather than to her, and there was something in the way he said it that sounded less like a complaint than like a man reminding himself of a principle he was finding increasingly difficult to maintain. Elspeth retrieved the natural history of the Somerset coast and left the library with her head held correctly level and her heart beating at a pace that was probably, she told herself, the result of having been startled by a large man in an unexpected space. Nothing more than that. Lady Winifred received the book, looked at Elspeth's expression, and said nothing at all, which was worse than commentary. After that, the library was not out of bounds. He did not say so. She did not ask. But the following afternoon there was a fire lit when she arrived to read, and a second chair had been positioned at the reading table, and the telescope had been cleaned and mounted correctly on its stand. Elspeth sat in the second chair and opened the natural history and told herself this was simply a professional development. An adjustment of household routine. The Duke came in an hour later, sat at his own table, opened a correspondence file, and did not speak to her for the entire afternoon. It was, she thought, the most comfortable she had been since arriving at Blackwood Hall. Which was probably something she should think carefully about. She decided to think about it later. The village fair at Ashwick happened every November, and Lady Winifred had attended it every year for 60 years without exception, which meant that the Duke of Raven attended it every year because there was no one in the known world, including Arthur Street Aubyn himself, who could refuse Lady Winifred anything she asked for with sufficient persistence and the right expression. Elspeth learned this when Winifred appeared at breakfast on the third Tuesday of the month and announced, with complete serenity, that she would be going to the fair that afternoon and that Elspeth would accompany her, and that Arthur would drive them himself because the regular coachman had a bad knee. The Duke, at the other end of the table, had gone very still in the way of a man absorbing unwelcome news. "You hate the fair," he said. "I adore the fair," Winifred said, buttering her bread with cheerful purpose. "It is you who hates the fair. I have attended for 60 years and I intend to attend for 60 more. You are 81. Then I shall be very busy." He drove them himself. He sat on the box with the expression of a man navigating a military operation rather than a village celebration, and when they arrived at the green where the fair was laid out, livestock pens and ribbon stalls and a fiddler playing something raucous near the apple sellers, he climbed down and looked at the entire proceedings as if calculating the fastest route through them. "I smell sheep," he said. "Yes," Elspeth said. "That is because there are sheep." He looked at her. She looked back. After a moment, something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but a reluctant acknowledgement that this was funny. Winifred was already moving toward a stall selling honey, propelled by genuine enthusiasm and a cane she wielded with tactical efficiency. Elspeth fell into step beside the Duke, who walked with the slightly too upright posture of a person trying to take up less space than they naturally occupy. "You could try to look less like you are attending an execution," Elspeth said. "I am expressing how I feel. You are frightening the children." He glanced down. A small girl near the ribbon stall had stopped moving and was staring at him with enormous eyes. He looked at Elspeth, then back at the child. Then he attempted something with his face that Elspeth could only describe as a smile. The child burst into tears and ran to her mother. That, Elspeth said, with great care, was not a smile. That was something else entirely. Something involving more teeth. I smile. You bared your teeth. There is a distinction. She positioned herself slightly in front of him, partly to block the child's mother from seeing the Duke's expression of wounded dignity, and partly because she was trying not to laugh. Try again. Think of something that pleases you. He thought. He produced a version of the previous expression, marginally less alarming. Better, she said. Marginally. You are the most impertinent woman I have encountered in Somerset, he said, but he was looking at the apple stall with something approaching equanimity. They found Winifred at the honey table, deep in conversation with a beekeeper of similar age. The fair moved around them. Elspeth bought a paper twist of roasted chestnuts and ate them while walking, which was not entirely proper but was very warm. The Duke walked beside her, silent, hands behind his back, gradually surrendering to the fact that the afternoon was not, in fact, a catastrophe. Then she heard the voices. There were 3 of them, young men, London-dressed and London-mannered, the kind who came to Somerset for hunting and treated everything else as entertainment. They were standing near the cider tent, and they were loud with the particular confidence of people who have never been told that their observations are not welcome. Morrow, isn't it? The parson's daughter. Thought she'd gone to be a lady's maid somewhere. Fitting, I suppose. Her father's a complete ruin. Gaming debts to half of London. Heard he sold her position here. Couldn't even manage that with dignity. Laughter. Easy and careless and completely indifferent to the woman standing 10 feet away who could hear every word. Elspeth went very still. She felt the heat rise in her face and the familiar narrowing sensation in her chest that she had been managing since the first rumors about her father had started 2 years ago. She had learned to look unaffected. She had become, she thought, reasonably skilled at looking unaffected. She turned away. That was the correct response. Turn away, find Winifred, make an excuse, go home. She had taken 2 steps when a figure moved past her with the kind of quiet authority that changed the quality of air around it. The Duke stopped 3 feet from the young men. He did not raise his voice. He did not lift a hand. He stood at his full height, which was considerable, and looked at them, and the laughter stopped like a clock being interrupted. I know your father, he said to the first one. Quietly. Conversationally. He owes me a considerable courtesy, as I believe I hold the note on his Wiltshire property. He turned to the second. Your family applied twice last year for permission to hunt the Blackwood grounds. I declined. I find I am unlikely to reconsider. He looked at the third, who had not spoken. You I don't know. I suggest you keep it that way. He turned his back on all 3 of them, an act of dismissal so complete it was almost architectural, and walked back to where Elspeth stood. She had not moved. He offered her his arm. It was a formal gesture, correct in every technical respect, but his face, when she looked up at it, was doing something she had not seen before. Something that was neither blank nor performed. Something that was simply present. They are gnats, he said quietly. You are a lioness. He held her gaze, steady and certain. Walk like one. She took his arm. They walked back to find Winifred, and Elspeth did not speak for several minutes because she was using all available resources to keep her expression appropriate. There was something happening in her chest that had nothing to do with humiliation and everything to do with the man walking beside her, who smelled of cedar and cold air and who had demolished 3 careless men with 10 sentences and offered her his arm afterward like it was nothing. Like she was worth defending without it being a performance. She had not encountered that before. The drive home was quiet. Winifred dozed against the carriage cushions with the peaceful assurance of a woman who had gotten everything she came for, including, Elspeth suspected, considerably more than the honey. In the dark of the carriage, Elspeth looked at her hands and told herself, firmly and clearly, that this was not a feeling she was going to act on. It was simply gratitude. It was simply the natural response of a person who had been defended unexpectedly. It was not, under any circumstances, going to grow into anything that would complicate her position, her livelihood, or the careful professional distance she had been maintaining since the library. She was quite resolute about this. She was also, she suspected, lying to herself. But that, at least, could be managed for a little while longer. The storm came in on a Thursday night, off the Bristol Channel, with the particular violence of late autumn weather that has been building patience for weeks and finally decided to spend it all at once. By midnight the windows of Blackwood Hall were shuddering in their frames, candles bent sideways in draughts no one could locate the source of, and the old house made sounds that Elspeth chose to attribute to timber and stone rather than anything else. Lady Winifred had taken her sleeping draught early, at 8, and the entire household had settled by 10. Elspeth had meant to sleep. She had her candle and her book and every intention of reading herself into unconsciousness, which was her usual method. Instead, at 11:30, she was still sitting at her writing desk watching the storm and thinking. It was the fair that had done it. More precisely, it was the arm. More precisely still, it was the expression on his face when he had said walk like one, direct and quiet and without performance, and the way it had made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since before her father's losses had turned her into primarily a problem to be managed. She was not a person who confused gratitude with something else. She had been careful about that for years. But this was not quite gratitude anymore, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. She took her candle and went to find a warmer room, because thinking in a cold room never improved anything. The portrait gallery ran the length of the first floor's north wing, a long corridor of dark frames and darker faces, dukes and duchesses going back to Charles II, their expressions uniformly composed and their painted eyes following the lamplight with the particular intensity of people who have been watching for a very long time. The Duke was at the far end. He was standing in front of a portrait of a woman, small, dark-haired, with the grey eyes he had inherited and an expression that was warm in a way his usual one was not. He was in his shirt sleeves again, a glass of something amber in one hand, and he had not heard her come in over the noise of the storm. She nearly turned back. She didn't. "Your Grace," she said softly. He turned, and for one unguarded moment she saw something on his face that was not the blankness and not the careful performance of a man managing his own distance from the world. It was simply pain, quiet and old, the kind that has been carried so long it has worn smooth. Then the habitual expression returned. "Miss Morrow." He looked at the candle she was carrying. "You should be asleep. The storm woke me." She moved to stand beside him, a respectful distance, and looked at the portrait. "Your mother. She died when I was 15. He looked back at the painting. "She was the only person in my life, for a long time, who found my interests reasonable rather than peculiar." "The stars," Elspeth said. "The stars. The telescope. The library." His jaw tightened briefly. "My father found it embarrassing. He wanted a son who hunted and drank and managed his estates from a comfortable distance. I was given to understand, quite clearly, that the life of the mind was not appropriate for a man of my position." The storm threw rain against the gallery windows. The candles along the walls bent and recovered. "And after your mother," Elspeth said, not a question exactly but an open space. He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman," he said. "Some years ago. I thought she understood what I was. She had read the same books. She asked questions about the telescope." He turned the glass in his hand. "She was being careful, it turned out. She wanted the title and the hall and the income. The astronomy was an investment in my attention. When she chose someone with a better social position, she told me privately that she found my habits tedious and my temperament exhausting." Elspeth said nothing. "I am not," he added, with a precision that told her how long he had been managing this particular knowledge, unaware of how I appear to people. "Cold. Difficult. Unsociable." He glanced down at her. "I am told I let women fall in the mud." "You did let me fall in the mud." "Yes." Something crossed his face. "I was thinking about the mirror alignment and I forgot to." He stopped. "That is not an excuse. I should have." "You were thinking about the telescope," Elspeth said. "I understand that, actually." She looked up at him steadily. "My father was the same way. He would forget meals when he was working on something. He forgot appointments, correspondence, obligations. It was maddening and it was also," she searched for the honest word, "genuine. He was genuinely elsewhere. Not absent. Just elsewhere." Arthur Street Aubyn looked at her for a long moment. The portrait gallery was very quiet around them, the storm outside making the silence inside feel more complete. You are very different from what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone timid. He said it straightforwardly, without apology. Most people who come here are timid. They have heard things. I heard things, Elspeth said. I decided not to believe all of them. Which ones did you believe? That you were reclusive. That you were difficult. That you had made a lord cry. She paused. That last one I've decided was probably warranted. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. The almost smile she had been seeing for 2 weeks now, the one that was real in a way his performed ones never were. He set down his glass on the gallery table and turned to face her properly, and the candlelight was doing things that she was choosing not to pay attention to, the way it caught the grey of his eyes, the way the shadows fell along his jaw. He reached out and took her hand. Not suddenly. Slowly, with enough time for her to step back if she chose to. His fingers were warm from the glass. I find, he said carefully, that I am no longer certain how to maintain my usual habits around you, Miss Morrow. He looked at her hand in his as if this, too, was a problem he was working through methodically. That is not a complaint. It is simply an observation. Arthur, she said, using his name for the first time, and watched him go very still. He leaned forward, the distance between them reducing in the slow and careful way of a man who has been alone for a long time and is not entirely certain what he is doing but has decided, finally, that not doing it is worse. The bell rang. It was Lady Winifred's bell, from the far end of the east wing, clear and persistent, the bell she rang when her sleep had been broken by the storm and she needed her drops and a warm drink and someone to sit with her until she drifted off again. They both stopped. A breath. 2. Elspeth stepped back. He released her hand. They stood in the portrait gallery with the storm making noise outside and the candles doing their best, and both of them looking at the middle distance rather than at each other. I should go, Elspeth said. Yes, he said. She went. She was halfway down the gallery when she heard him say, quietly, to the empty room and the portrait of his mother, I fear I am in considerable difficulty. Elspeth walked to Lady Winifred's room and spent 40 minutes making warm drinks and sitting in the lamplight, and did not allow herself to think about the gallery until Winifred was safely asleep again. Then she sat in the chair beside the fire and thought about it thoroughly. She was in considerable difficulty too. Her father arrived on a Friday morning, unannounced, with mud on his boots and a smile that Elspeth recognized as the one he wore when he had already made a decision and was arriving to inform her of it rather than to consult her. She met him in the front parlor. Mrs. Pruitt, with the discretion of long practice, had them shown in and then disappeared. Elspeth. He kissed her cheek. He looked around the room with the assessing eye of a man calculating values. Well. He keeps a fine house, the Duke. What are you doing here, father? He sat, adjusted his coat, and told her. His name was Sir Edmund Hargrove. He was 60, a widower, and had expressed considerable interest in Elspeth since before her father's losses had made the Morrow family interesting to men like Sir Edmund, which told her something precise and unpleasant about his character. He had property. He had income. He had made it worth her father's while to bring her home. You've been here long enough, her father said, with the cheerful tone of a man who did not expect to be argued with. Edmund is a fair man. You'll be comfortable. Sir Edmund is older than you, Elspeth said. Many husbands are older than their wives. I have not met him. You'll meet him when you get home. Her father's tone shifted slightly toward the impatient. Elspeth, you know the situation. There is no money. There is no family property. Edmund is offering a real home and security. You are not in a position to be selective. She had heard some version of this sentence for 2 years. She had absorbed it, adjusted to it, managed around it. It had shaped every decision she had made about not complicating things, about professional distance, about the careful boundaries she had tried to maintain in the library and the portrait gallery and everywhere else at Blackwood Hall. She looked at her father, who was not a cruel man, who loved her in the scattered, insufficient way of a person who had never quite learned to place other people's needs ahead of his own convenience, and she said, very calmly, no. The word surprised him. It surprised her slightly as well. No. I am not going home with you. I have a position here, a good one, and I intend to keep it. Elspeth. And I am not going to marry Sir Edmund Hargrove. She stood. I appreciate that you are trying to manage an impossible situation, father. I know the debts are real. But you cannot manage them by handing me to someone who sees me as a solution to a financial calculation. Her father stood too, and now his expression had moved from cheerful to something harder. You forget yourself. You are here at the Duke's sufferance. Is there a problem? It was not a question. Arthur Street Aubyn stood in the doorway of the front parlour in his full formal coat, this one impeccable, the Duke of Raven performing his title for the first time in her experience, with the expression that had made a lord cry and 3 young men at the fair go very quiet. Her father turned. Adjusted his posture. Your Grace. I am merely here to collect my daughter. Family business, nothing that need concern. Miss Morrow is in my household's employ, Arthur said. He came into the room at a measured pace and stopped beside Elspeth, close enough that she was within his peripheral attention. Her position here is of significant value to my aunt, who is in poor health and depends considerably on the quality of her companion. Any removal of Miss Morrow from this household would be inconvenient. She is my daughter. She is an adult woman. Arthur's voice had not risen by a fraction. In a legal and permanent position, with all the protections that entails. Her father looked between them. He was not a stupid man. What exactly is the nature of this arrangement? That is not your concern. Arthur looked at him steadily. What is your concern, I think, is the question of your debts. A pause. Her father went still. Arthur produced a document from his coat and Elspeth recognized, with a sensation somewhere between astonishment and vertigo, that it was legal, that it was formal, and that it had her father's name on it. I hold your notes, Arthur said simply. 3 of them, as of yesterday. I purchased them from your creditors, who were, I'm told, losing patience. He held out the document. This is the paperwork. The debts are cleared. You owe me nothing. I ask nothing in return. He set the papers on the table in front of her father. I would suggest, he said, that you use the time this buys you wisely. Her father looked at the papers. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Elspeth, who was looking at the Duke with an expression she was no longer trying to manage. With the particular dignity of a man who understood when he had been outmaneuvered, her father picked up his hat and his gloves and said he would see himself out. The door closed. Silence. Elspeth looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at Arthur, who was standing 2 feet away looking at the wall with the careful posture of a man waiting for something and not entirely sure what it will be. You bought his debts, she said. Yes. When? Yesterday. He paused. I made inquiries after the fair. After the fair. After the 3 young men at the cider tent, after the arm, after the walk back to find Winifred. He had gone home and made inquiries and spent, she suspected, a considerable sum, and had said nothing and waited. Arthur. She picked up the papers and held them out to him. I can't let you hold this over him. I'm not holding it over him, he said, looking at the papers with slight confusion. It's a gift. I told you, he owes me nothing. Then take these back. They're paid. They're his. I don't, he stopped. Looked at her face. I didn't do it as a transaction, Elspeth. I did it because, he stopped again. Because, she said quietly. The light in the front parlour was flat and grey and honest, the kind that did not do favours, and in it Arthur Street Aubyn looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been alone for a long time and had recently, against all his careful arrangements, stopped being able to manage it. Because I could not watch someone use you as an instrument for their own convenience, he said. Because in the gallery on Thursday night I was half a second from, he exhaled. Because, if I am honest, which I have been told I am occasionally to a fault, I do not want you to leave Blackwood Hall, and I would remove any obstacle I could reach to prevent it. Elspeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she did the thing she had been carefully, sensibly, professionally not doing for 3 weeks. She tore the papers in half. He stared at her. I don't want to leave Blackwood Hall, she said. I don't want to leave because my father says so, or because Sir Edmund is convenient, or because a lady's companion is supposed to know her limits. She set the torn papers on the table. I want to stay because this is the first place in 2 years where I have felt entirely like myself. Where someone has argued with me about telescope lenses and let me eat chestnuts while walking and stood in front of dreadful people at a fair and not made any of it into a performance. Arthur was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It was open, entirely unmanaged, startled in the way of someone who has been handed something they did not quite dare hope for. "I tore those," she said. "Which means the debts are gone regardless and I have nothing to gain from staying." "I know," he said. So, he said, and then, very slowly, as if he was still working out the precise mechanics of the decision, he reached out and took her face in both hands, careful, as he was with the telescope, as he was with the old brass fittings that required gentleness, and kissed her. It was nothing like the lightning of novels. It was warm and present and entirely itself, the way he was unhurried, precise, decided. His hands were steady. Hers found the lapels of his immaculate coat and held on. When he pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she understood, finally, was his real face. The one underneath the grey blankness and the managed distance, the one he'd been keeping for people who deserved it. "For the record," Elspeth said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "that was a great improvement on letting me fall in the mud." "I have been reconsidering that decision since approximately the second day," he said. "Only the second?" "The first day I was thinking about the mirror alignment." She laughed. He watched her laugh with the expression of a man cataloguing something valuable. Then, slowly, as if his face was remembering how, he smiled. A real one. Not the teeth-baring performance from the fair, not the carefully constructed pleasantness he deployed for visiting solicitors and county dinners. A real smile, private and warm, the kind that transformed the severe architecture of his face into something entirely other. It was, Elspeth thought, the most remarkable thing she had seen since arriving at Blackwood Hall. More remarkable than the library, the telescope, the rubid November light through the gallery windows. "There," she said softly. "That's the one I've been waiting for." "I don't do it often," he said. "No." She straightened his coat lapels, which were perfectly straight, because she needed something to do with her hands. "I suppose Winifred handed them each a cup." She looked at Elspeth with the grey eyes that were so like Arthur's and so entirely warmer, and said, "I told you he wasn't as bad as he seemed." "You were right," Elspeth said. "I usually am." Winifred settled back in her chair with her tea and her absolute contentment. "Now, someone tell me what happened with my father's debt papers, because I could hear the tearing from here and I want every detail." The beast of Blackwood Hall was never, in truth, a beast. He was a man who had forgotten that the right person would find his silences comfortable rather than cold, his precision a form of care rather than coldness, and his heart, once located, larger than the house he hid it in. Elspeth Morrow arrived in the mud and left, some months later, as the Duchess of Raven. She continued to correct his telescope alignments. He continued to let her. And somewhere in the East Wing, Lady Winifred drank her tea and felt entirely satisfied with the outcome of a plan 60 years of living had taught her to execute.